Comment under old business, I guess.
Yes, sir.
And I find this a little bit disconcerting. I'm a relative neophyte here. I've only been on council for 3 months, so I can plead ignorance. And even if I were here longer, probably still plead ignorance. But I don't quite understand why there isn't better communication between the auditor's office and the administration. When this council gets put in a position where we're trying to explain transferring of funds, and one is saying that they're needed and should be done, and another saying we don't have to do it, can't those discussions take place before we get into a public arena like this? I guess like the end of that is, I'll answer my own question. I would encourage you to do that so that we don't waste time and embarrass ourselves here by asking what can be interpreted as stupid questions.
I appreciate the question, Mr. Hellman, and I'm going to answer it this way.
I'd like an answer.
It is your responsibility. The administration's job is to propose their desires in terms of how they want to operate the city and request the funds from this body. It is your responsibility to appropriate the funds. Mm-hmm. So, in tonight, in answering Mrs. Frisch's questions, we answer them. I answer them directly. The administration desired that you transfer $1.5 million from the general fund to capital improvements. I've made my recommendations to this body on a regular basis, as well as the administration, Mr. Smelzer, and whether I agree, disagree, or not is irrelevant. Ultimately, they make the request of you, but you have to do the most prudent thing as a body, not you in particular, and I'm not directing this as a personal response. So that being said, one of the questions was asked is, should we have a committee of the whole? Had you had a committee of the whole, I would have been in a position to suggest possibly more prudent methods of utilizing those funds. For example, you could have paid for paving out of the general fund, and by paying for it out of the general fund, not transferred monies to capital improvements and obligated those funds to capital improvements ad infinitum. In other words, now that that money's been transferred, it's never coming back to general fund. And as I mentioned 2 meetings ago in a situation, the funds that have been built today are not likely to build as fast. So the conversations I have with the administration are basically, here's where you're at, here's where you're going. Paul and I do communicate, so there's no communication issue there from that aspect. Your interpretation of what's happening, I can see where it's coming from, but it's not a communication issue. I hope this body understands you're responsible for appropriating the money, and so I address to you, in my opinion, I would ask some questions before I appropriate that money. And we didn't have an appropriate venue to do that.
And you also had those kinds of discussions with Mr. Smelzer or the mayor prior to this?
Exactly how I feel, yes.
Okay.
This is
Ms. Frischy.
I'm just going to make this final comment because I feel like there's some tension in the room. I emailed the administration, Paul, I emailed the auditor, I email any department or make conversation with. I'm not getting my answers, unfortunately, when I send emails to the administration or make phone calls. So when I ask my further questions, they happen here. But I did talk to the auditor's office this morning after water and sewer to ask my additional questions in person of my concerns. And simply, this was my view on how we should handle appropriations. But I was not put on appropriations, but I am a council person, and that is where I had to ask my questions, unfortunately. So I just think I need to put that out there.
And I feel badly. I do not want the community thinking that there's a problem with, when I talk to Paul, we talk about approaches. We talk about the standard growth of revenue, which we know is just over 3%. He wants expenses to grow at less than, obviously, or equal to the way revenues grow. When we talk about money. We talk about issues. He was in my office 2 days ago, and we spent almost an hour talking about the projects up north around the cube so that I can properly address how I want to handle the debt up there. So there isn't a communications problem. And we are communicating to make sure we have the information we need so proper financial decisions can be discussed. However, ultimately, this body has to decide what they want to do. And if you're going to follow the administration, we don't have to agree, but it's your decision.
Well, then, I guess I'm interpreting then you had the conversation and you didn't agree, and this is what the administration presented to us. Correct?
That's right. That's right. Because that's
and I presented that to council as well.
That's
in my
prerogative.
opinion,
I mean, that's just kind of the way things work, Councilman. I'm not saying that that's the way things work in general, but this give and take, it's not unusual in any form of government.
Give and take is good.
For the executive branch to communicate with the legislative branch, because you are the fighting arm. I will say this. We put forth a plan for capital spending. We put forth a plan because we feel as though it's the prudent thing to do. We have a very delicate balance to continue to try and achieve here at the City of Findlay. While our balances are healthy in terms of cash, we're growing those because we are prudently spending your tax dollars throughout the year in a sensible way, and we take the savings that we achieve throughout the year, whether that's through health care and or other things that may not pan out. You know, we jokingly say that we didn't get any credit for the savings on the salt for this year, but we took the criticism when we, spent the money to begin with. So when we take those savings and it goes back into the general fund, we have in our capital plan, because we know how important infrastructure spending is in this community, we take that savings and then we ask you to transfer it into the capital plan, because that gives us cash. And cash is king, particularly in the beginning of the year when we're trying to get our paving projects out. There's a significant amount of savings relative to us bidding it early. We've seen that the last couple of years. It's nice to talk about our cash balances, and it's nice to talk about our financial health that we have as of recent, but it wasn't that long ago when we sat in this council chamber and we're talking about what we would need to do to prevent $6 million worth of revenue from leaving the city in a year. I mean, that's why we had the whole discussion about the income tax, permanent, temporary, you name it, whatever you want, whatever the council ended up doing. And it wasn't long ago when the auditor talked about us needing to spend $7 million, I think was the number, per year on paving in order to keep up with our needs. I think it was some analysis that he had done from some research. So we're doing what we feel is prudent. We know that it is a tough balance to try and achieve. We know we have staffing issues that we still have yet to try and address, and we're working with our department heads to make that happen. As our revenue shows growth, we can add staffing so we can quit using that as a political point, because if we decide to continue to spend more than what we take in our operations, then we're deficit spending. And this administration has not taken that as an approach in the last couple of years. In fact, we've tried to be as close to balanced as we can. And with the uncertainty with revenue, because you just never know where it's going to go, you try and plan for a budget that's going to meet the number that Jim gives us. And sometimes that works, and it's great, and it's right on track, and sometimes it's way down, like it was in 2014. Thank God we had money left over in our budget to be able to fill that gap. And sometimes we get a lot more than what we anticipate. So it's difficult. I understand Councilwoman Frisch's desire to want to have a 5-year operations budget plan. I would too. But that means I have to have the revenue side of the house just as consistent as the expenses on the operations side as well. So there are a lot of moving pieces. There are a lot of things that we have to consider. Our jobs definitely aren't easy, but I appreciate your willingness to work with us as we try and continue to move this community forward.
We make every effort to do that. We
Yes, you
appreciate
do.
what you go through.
Thank you very much.
If I might add a final thought, what used to happen that doesn't happen anymore, my office used to regularly report through appropriations, different perspectives on the finances and different perspectives on where the money's at, so that council would go to the administration and council would get the administration's opinion and their desires, what they want to do. And then council would come to the auditor's office and get the auditor's independent look at where the finances were at and their perspective on the money. I want this body to know that I would be happy to come on a monthly basis, weekly basis, regular basis to discuss the details of the finances from an independent perspective, so that you might get that information from my office that way, should you desire to do that as council members. And I can tell you, and no disrespect to the newspaper in the room, for example, in the Progress edition, of all the numbers that were reported on the income taxes and the receipts and everything else, only one of them was correct. So you want to be very cautious where you get the information or where you read about our finances. And our reports are important that we give you every month, and I want to make sure that you guys know I'm available for you, and I'll be happy to do that, so you can ask those questions prior to those meetings. Thanks.
Mr. Stasiak, you said that once funds are appropriated to capital improvements, it's there ad infinitum. Are you telling me there's no way that if we would decide for whatever reason we're not going to do a particular project, that that money cannot ever go back into the general fund?
That's right. That's the law.
Well,
So right now you have appropriated $6.7 million of projects in your general fund projects. You have encumbered about 3.4 million of that 6.7. You have $3.3 million prior to tonight that's just sitting there doing nothing.
but by the same token, if we would decide in 2017 that we could appropriate less to go into the capital improvements.
You could change it today if you wanted to. The question is what's the right balance? How does each body want to do business, and are we making decisions from an informed perspective? And that's the whole idea.
You just said we could change it today if we wanted to.
You can't move the money, but you can change your allocation of the income tax. So again, it goes to the complexity of the question. This body has done business a particular way with its finances over the last 4 years, and it's balanced and it's working and the city's doing well. It's different than the way you did it in years past, which is different than the way you did it in administrations before. The question is, what's the right balance? How do you want to use the cash flow? How do you want to leverage the funds? But most importantly, will there be monies there 3 to 5 years down the road? And are we looking at that to make sure we're protecting ourselves? Because it's not likely you're going to build cash balances like you've built in the last 4 years, because you had the double benefit of an economy improving and cuts being implemented, creating a large cash balance. So you've created a large cash balance. Now, the increase in the cash balance will be directly attributed to the difference between operational expenses and revenues as you move forward. So it's not likely to grow by the large leaps and bounds that it has in the recent past. Food for thought. Great topic for a meeting in the future.
Any other new business?